hello. Okay. So let me just start. In this presentation, I just will share with everyone a journey I struggled through somehow myself, and so show you the process. And we basically are going to be asking a series of questions, which are probably more heuristic than requiring a really kind of ultimate answer. But I guess we will be spending the most time on this initial question: are video games modern? But well, I guess further questions will be actually more important. So we just get into this question. I guess I don't have enough time to explain everything, so we just ask this question: are video games modern? And I guess there's something I need to explain. So this question is not an ontological one. We're not actually asking what a game is. We're kind of asking, what does being a game suggest? We care more about connotations rather than denotations. And so here I sketched a little roadmap for how we try to answer this question. So first, we really need to kind of define modernity again, because modernity is something with huge content, with somehow a little bit vague. So, and then the second, we still need some methodological work, because, well, so how to find whether video games are modern or are not. So later we'll see. We'll end up doing structural comparisons, but how to carry out the structural comparison, which structure from video games, which structure from modernity are we comparing, and how to compare them is still in question. Well, the third is just try to carry out. So that's the brief roadmap. So first, I will give you a super brief review of the theories on modernity. In this very, really simplified picture, there are basically two aspects of modernity. It's temporality and rationality. So about temporality, it's basically like, I guess Kalinetsky once said, the consciousness of modern is a consciousness of modern time, something like that. So this is basically how this aspect of modernity talks about. Its examples are like Benjamin's homogeneous and empty time in his historical philosophy, and and various people did the kind of philology or the etymological investigation on the word modern, and which shows how a modern consciousness of time appeared. And there's also the politics of time, which is termed by Osborne. And for the rationality part, there are really a lot of texts on it. To start with, we have the very classic definition of rationalization by Max Weber. And for Weber, rationalization is already something to be reflected upon. It's already a reflection upon modern rationality. And so in this category, about rationality, it's basically a lot of critiques and reflections, like Heidegger's philosophy of technology, which define technology as a kind of challenging the nature and maybe finally a way of control. And there's the dueling pair of governmentality and critique by Foucault, and there's a grand narrative critiqued by Lyotard, etc., etc. And there are also theories that combine or integrate these two aspects. So actually, in principle, any grand narrative, for example, like Enlightenment as an exit or any historical teleology, they are all combining the temporality side and the rationality part of modernity. They're combine these two into some kind of a story thing. And besides these way of talking about modernity, there are kind of two figures that's a little bit special. One is Anthony Giddens. He's actually also talking about temporality and rationality, but in a slightly different way. His terminology is like the empty of time is the first, and then the emptying of time enables the process of disembedding, and disembedding enables the process of reflexivity, and that's basically reflexivity is what Giddens calls, what Giddens named the rationality of our modern society. And there's also Bruno Latour, who is kind of really special. My major inspiration of asking the question, are video games modern, is from Latour, but I guess I'm not going to go through his theory. Okay. So basically, it's just two aspects of modernity, right? So then we try to figure out what to compare. So first, I guess we should drop out rationality because it's kind of complicated, and for temporality, it's much simpler. And also, there's some conceptual arguments. It's actually by Giddens, and I just mentioned because according to Giddens, the emptying of time, some kind of modern time, enables disembedding and further enables reflexivity. So here it's like a modern temporality enables modern rationality. So I guess it'll be better to start with temporality. We'll come back to rationality later. And so here we need to make the model, the modern temporality more specific. So I'm trying to figure out a kind of a standard model of modern time. So we start from Benjamin's homogeneous and empty time. So, it's quite obvious that the homogeneous part and the empty part are separable. So I just divide it up into two properties. So the first one is homogeneity. That means time passes homogeneously. And the second part is emptiness. It means that the question of simultaneity can always be answered without any ambiguity, and regardless of the two events, the nature of the two events, regardless of the space-time or the context or the background, whatever. And also, for Benjamin's homogeneous and empty time, it's a quite strong assumption. Besides homogeneity and emptiness, it also supposes that homogeneity and emptiness are transcendental and universal. Transcendental means it has not little to do with experience, and universal means it can be applied to everywhere. And now we basically figured out the modernity side, and then we should try to find which part of video games are we comparing with a modern temporality. So here I propose that we compare certain game mechanics. We're not telling if a whole game is modern or not. We're trying to find if certain game mechanics are producing so certain game mechanics are producing some kind of conception of time, and if that conception of time is modern or not. That's what we're going to do. So, that's the first step. And also we need to figure out how those examples we choose, the game mechanics we choose, are they really important in video games? Are they common, or are they too special? If they're too special, I guess that might not be very good examples to. So basically three steps. First, we find some game mechanics that can generate some conception of time, and the second is we compare that conception of time with the modern temporality, and third, we figure out the salience of those game mechanics we chose. So here I use two examples, or two game mechanics. The first one is the mechanics of time compression and time dilation, and I will show you that this is not really compatible with homogeneity. I guess that's actually quite obvious. Here. So the example is from Euro Truck Simulator, and this is from the manual. It says Euro Truck Simulator has its own time cycle, which runs considerably faster than real time, and also time compression ratio is different depending on whether you are driving outside or inside the cities. So it's quite obvious that time here is not homogeneous. And we should ask why. What's the reason behind this? It's actually quite simple. It's for gameplay and player experience. It's on the highway, time is compressed in order that the long distance shipping not turn into an ordeal. It should be something pleasure. And in town, time is relatively dilated in order that player can relax and doesn't need to rush to the next job. So the reason is purely for gameplay and player experience. And how salient is this kind of mechanics? I guess it's not everywhere, but it's pretty common. So it could be part of the core game mechanics. It could also be in a lot of games, tweaks in gameplays. So I guess that's pretty important. So we can make a conclusion here. It's like in this mechanics, time is created, and it could be partially homogeneous, but this homogeneity cannot be universal, and it's actually not transcendental because it's strongly related to experience. So, and I further claim that here game mechanics is quite indifferent to the homogeneity of time. What it cares is gameplay and player experience. And the second example is about SafeLoad mechanics, and I'll show you how it somehow contradicts with the emptiness of time. So, actually, for most single-player games, for most of the time, there's only a present time for the player, unless there's a narrative telling that what the protagonists do here is simultaneous with some other story elsewhere. And unless it's in a narrative, there's no simultaneity in single-player games usually. But save and load mechanics are actually creating a kind of unreal simultaneity. I'll show you with another example from Batman Arkham Knight. So in Batman Arkham Knight, there's some kind of failure cutscene, basically showing you sometimes showing you the consequence if Batman failed. So in a certain mission, which is the assault of GCPD, if the player failed, a cutscene would be shown, would show the possible dire outcome of this failure. There will be a massacre in GCPD by Arkham Knight's militia. I'll show you a few screenshots. So this massacre is actually not real in a canon timeline. A typical playthrough of this mission might look like this. For example, like the first trial, and then failure, and the failure cutscene, and then the second trial, maybe fail again, and so the cutscene again, until the player success. So formally, this series looks like a montage, or to be more specific, a cross-cutting. And in cross-cutting in films, it's actually constructing a simultaneity between two or more events. So formally, this trial and fail and failure scene, the series is like a cross-cutting, and so it's formally is creating a kind of unreal simultaneity. And for the salience of such game mechanics, so I guess it's a trivial one. So save and load is kind of really common. And what I'm further arguing here is that every game with save and load mechanics structurally has this failure cutscene, which is usually just invisible. So only in Batman Arkham Knight, this kind of structural existence shows itself, manifests itself, but actually they're already there. And for most games with save load mechanics, this weird unreal simultaneity actually seems natural, and for players, they usually don't require an explanation for this kind of weird unreal simultaneity. Thus, we can conclude that the save load mechanics is creating an unreal simultaneity which is local and specific, and this time structure is somehow empty because like player can have multiple indefinite time instances of trials, but this is quite the opposite from universal and transcendental since it's really specific and local. So again, we find here in video games, the standard model of modern time is actually not taken seriously. And so we used basically two game mechanics to show that video games are quite not serious about the modern temporality. And then we further want to ask, are these time structures produced by video games? So if they are not modern, are they postmodern? Because structurally they look pretty like collages. Well, actually, it really looks like the time described by Borges in his fiction *The Garden of Forking Path*. Structurally, they're really similar. So it's actually pretty tempting to define these time structures produced by video games as postmodern. But are they? So here I argue that there are some actually crucial differences. For example, the first one is that Borges' exotic time structure is actually transcendental. He kind of think of this structure in his mind, and in that fiction, it is not too much to do with the narrative. Actually, it's just there. So it's quite the contrary with video games, and also for video games. So in the fiction of Borges, that time structure feels really weird, really exotic. But in video games, they feel kind of natural. So that's some crucial difference. And I explained. So video games produce these kind of structures because of for the reason of gameplay and play experience. So that's the reason why they feel quite natural. So I guess they're structurally similar, but actually different things. And we can further ask why video games are creating these non-trivial structures but feels normal. Here I provide a principle to try to answer this question. This is what I call the principle of unsimilability. So the formula reads the playability of a game times the fidelity of simulation should be no greater than some constant. This is just a formal thing, but it puts a limit on how real a simulation in game can be. I guess that makes sense because for video games, when reality will kill the fun, video game will always choose fun, I guess. So video games run their simulations with certain constraints. And we can also, another further question, even further questions, is like, so video games are running simulations with some their own logic. So then the principle of unsimilability basically puts the limit. It says what video games don't do. So what do video games do when they simulate? And I have some inspiration from Latour. He says, time is not a general framework, but a provisional result of the connection among entities. And when Latour defines social, what's the social, he says it's only as a very peculiar movement of reassociation and reassembling. So I guess video games are also kind of reassemble. So I'll explain what is reassemble. Well, so this comic is basically showing that. Well, I guess you probably know the original. There's a drawing, a pipe, and says this is not a pipe, with the caption saying that it's not a pipe. And this comic kind of referred to that drawing, but also put Mario in. And somehow the caption, the sentence in the caption is correct. And there's some kind of twist here. So what's reassembled here? Well, there are various things. For example, pipe in the original drawing is just for smoking. And here, when Mario is here, pipe is for tunneling into another level or sub-level, something like that. So different things are associated in this drawing. So this is just what a reassembling is. And so I guess video games are really reassembling in their simulations. And this simulation is enabled by modern technologies. Like in the example of Euro Truck Simulator, the simulation is actually tweaked to adjust the ratio between different experiences, like in town and in cities, something. And actually, that basically is creating a new experience. And in these reassemblings, the connotations of the original things and processes are somehow twisted or changed. So, I guess the last three slides. So, I said we'll come back to rationality. So this is how we do it. So since well, so for the question of rationality, if we still ask a question, the initial question, are video games modern from the aspect of the aspect of rationality? I'd say video games cannot be indifferent to modern rationality. They inevitably have some consequential interactions. And there are basically, I guess, three patterns for such interactions. The first one is just colonization. Just external rationality are kind of invading video games or just adopted in video games. And there can also be instrumentalization, like serious games or persuasive games. Gamification use game as tools and to affect modern rationality in our society. And as video games are also a kind of reassembling, I guess it enables a third pattern of interaction between video games and modern rationality, which I will use an example to illustrate. So it's based on a preliminary research on the language of Chinese internet subcultures. It's basically about the terms we use in Chinese subcultures. And well, I found that in in video games, a lot of video games terms in Chinese are originally common words borrowed from everyday life. And some of the words are borrowed back to common use. So in this borrowing and borrowing back, some really interesting things happens. Like so in video games, there's hit point, there's mana point, and now in everyday life language, there's face point, describing how good looking one is. So now we don't say good looking, we say he or she has a high face point. And immersion used to be a term only applicable to video games, but now we are applying it to literature and film. And also worldview. Worldview in Chinese used to mean something about truth, about meaning of life, about the ontology of the world, but now it means something virtual. It means how a virtual world, how the elements in the virtual world setting. So I guess it's really interesting. So this observation suggests that the reassembling enables a kind of maybe the third pattern of interaction between video games and modern rationality. And so in this way, I guess video games could be a reflexive and somehow philosophical action upon modernity. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Because of time pressure, we only have time for one question. So I hope that someone has a good question. Yes.
All right. So, I enjoyed your talk. I thought it was very interesting. I would want to argue that you maybe underemphasize the modernity of computer games by focusing too much on the content of the game. And I think the context of the game is perhaps more defining. That is, that first of all, the digital technologies used to create computer games are themselves essentially products of modernity. They're the combination of modernist logic and rationality combined with the idea of the modern machine. So that's the underlying technology. And also then, that is in computer games, this technology is combined with the modernist concept of leisure, which is a modern product. The fact that we have leisure time in which we can enjoy ourselves. So the way that leisure is produced in modernity, it's by commodifying and professionalizing leisure. The kind of experiences that we would like to have are constructed for us in a particular way, and that's what also computer games do. They provide us with experiences, with pleasure, with things that we like to do in leisure time as a kind of a package. So I think the context of computer games is very modern. Yes. And then the content of those games, I would say, can be different because it's a creative process. So some of that content is modern, some of the content is perhaps postmodern or amodern. So that's why I'm a bit wary to say it's amodern or it's this or that, because content is always a creative process, so it can go in different directions. Yes. But the context, I think, is modern. I don't know if you would agree.
Yeah. So for leisure, I guess I'm not so sure. But for the context of video games, like the modern technologies, the point I wanted to make is like, well, compared with more traditional games, video games with modern computer technologies are able to actually carry out simulations, and in those simulations, so the reassembling happens in those simulations. So actually, modern technology enables video games to better reassemble what's in our, yeah, I guess that's the point. Okay. Sorry for the overtime.
Thank you very much. I just have to request that our two last speakers stay on time because of this time pressure with the room. But thank you very much. And now I would like